I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Dan Kelly, and then John Chrisman here from Penn State Philosophy will introduce Michael Brownstein. I've known Dan for quite some time. I think I was a grad student about 15 years ago when I first joined Moral Psychology Research Group, when Dan hosted it at Purdue in 2011. I've kind of followed your work for almost 2 decades now, which is, I'm going to really lean into how that span of time is how I describe your work. But for those who don't know, Dan's work kind of encompasses philosophy of mind, cognitive science. He had a book called Yuck, The Moral Significance of Disgust before this one. He's published on a lot of different things in terms of experimental philosophy, cognitive science, moral psychology, climate change, social norms, implicit bias and responsibility. I recall as when I was an early student, one of my first, interesting dives into experimental philosophy was reading your work on philosophical attributions about implicit racial bias. I think as we think about fragmentations of morality and fragmentations of disciplinary boundaries, I think there are, two ways that I think this keynote really highlights the different ways we can think of fragmentations. We can think about, as Matt Lindauer's talk nicely described, kind of how we bridge psychology and philosophy, the social sciences and the humanities, and try to foster crosstalk. But I think we can also, through the content of your talk today, think about how do we encourage people to break beyond ways in which they conceptualize the challenges the world throws at them, how to encourage people to break defaults, to engage in collective action. And so I think there's a couple different ways that this really does speak centrally to how we think about fragmentations. But I'll turn it over now to John Chrisman from Penn State Philosophy.
Yes, I'll be brief. I've known Michael since he was a graduate student. I had the privilege of working with him when he did his dissertation which he finished in 2009 here in our philosophy department. And as many of you know, when you work with some graduate students, your chief job is just to get out of their way. And I succeeded in doing that with Michael. He went on to a flourishing career and worked, he's now professor and chair at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the CUNY Graduate Center. He has published widely in areas of cognitive science, moral agency, implicit bias, and numerous articles. And some of the highlights is his first book, The Implicit Mind, Cognitive Architecture, the Self, and Ethics, and co-edited 2 volumes on implicit bias. And now with his co-authors, Alex Magda and Dan Kelly, has produced this amazing new book. And I take it as a kind of culmination, even though it seems like a break, of Michael's really incredible ability to see both social scientific, psychological issues, philosophical questions, ethical motivations, but also questions of action, of the manifestation of human thought and motivation in the world for productive ends. So I was very pleased to introduce Michael.
Thank you so much. It's really fun and an honor to be here and to be back here and to have John and so many other colleagues here. So this is the last at the end of a long day, and I feel like I should go around with the coffee and just like make everyone drink more. But we'll try to keep this lively. I'm going to introduce the sort of problem that we got excited about and wanted to write a book about, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dan. And he's going to talk about the middle section of the book, and then I'm going to come back up and talk about some practical applications that we drew from our work. We are 2 of the 3 authors. So this is Alex Madva, our collaborator, who's out in California and can't be here today, and is the person responsible for everything we say wrong. Okay. So I want to start by telling just a story, which is a story of a conflict in the United States that really was brewing in the 1920s about pedestrian accidents, people getting hit by cars. And the problem was that until cars proliferated in the United States, streets were places in cities where living happened. People would stop in the middle of the street to have a conversation. Kids would play games. But of course, that became increasingly dangerous as cars were all over the place. And so there was a conflict brewing about sort of who the streets belonged to, pedestrians or cars. And this gave rise to efforts to solve the problem. One kind of an effort was to pass policy that would try to make the situation safer for people. Cincinnati, for instance, tried to have a ballot initiative that would put governors in cars that would restrict their speed to 25 miles an hour. Over 10% of the city signed the initiative to try and get this law passed. A group of automobile executives formed a lobbying group to try to squash it, and they in fact did, and the measure ended up failing. But car companies were seeing the writing on the wall, that this would be bad for business if cities around the country passed restrictive legislation. And so in addition to trying to fight back against legislation, what they also tried to do was change the conversation. So John Hertz, whose name you'll recognize, said, for instance, "We are living in a motor age, and we must have not only motor age education, but a motor age sense of responsibility. The streets are for vehicle traffic, the sidewalks for pedestrians." So the idea here was to shift cultural ideas about responsibility for increasing traffic accidents onto the shoulders of ordinary people, right? It's their fault for walking out into the street without being careful. And in fact, the American Automobile Association that he helped to start coined a neologism to criticize people who were at fault. Can anyone guess what that neologism was? A jaywalker, right? So this was a portmanteau of two words. A jay was an epithet about country, people from the country. And a walker, obviously, is someone who's walking around the city. So to be a jaywalker was to be somebody who was like, didn't know how to walk around the city safely. Incidentally, they also had, one lovely quote that I forgot I was going to mention from John Hertz, telling you a little bit about his political sensibilities. They also sponsored a contest to come up with another neologism for irresponsible drivers, because they recognize, right, this can't be just the problem with pedestrians. It can also be the fact that individuals don't drive safely. This one probably no one will get. Anyone? It was a flivverboob was the winning entry of the contest. Did not stick with us for one reason or another. The playbook is what we were interested in this book, in this story. The playbook of shifting responsibility for complex social problems onto the shoulders of individuals. And it's a playbook that you can recognize in all kinds of features of American culture and discussion, from how to prevent forest fires to how to drink responsibly. We talk a lot about this campaign in the book, which you may recognize from perhaps the most famous public service announcement in American history, which is colloquially known as the Crying Indian ad. Came out on Earth Day in 1970 and was a nominally anti-pollution advertisement. It was created by a group of executives from disposable container companies who, again, wanted to shift responsibility off of them. They wanted to prevent cities and states from passing laws banning disposable containers and put the responsibility for the problem on us. And the PSA ends with this memorable line that people start pollution and people can stop it. You may have heard of having a personal carbon footprint. You may also know, or maybe you don't, that that concept was popularized by BP, the oil giant. And so I want you to sort of conceive of this as in the same vein of what some communication scholars have called responsibilization. Again, so it's a playbook that we sort of identify in the book as a very canny corporate PR strategy for taking attention off of solving problems through restrictive legislation or government action or changing our institutions and laws, and putting those problems on each of us as responsible agents for solving them. this Onion-esque headline is meant to capture something that might make you uncomfortable about the responsibilization, which is that there's something crazy about thinking that any one of us, through our mundane actions, can solve something as giant and complex and global as climate change, right? And there's a lot of pushback against this idea of putting problems on individual people across different domains of discussion. So in popular writing, you may have seen headlines like this: I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle, right? The real problem is the oil and gas industry. Or you can't save climate by going vegan. Corporate polluters must be held accountable. Right? So the point here is that this is a pushback against that long history that I just told you about. And it's a pushback that we've seen over the last couple decades, particularly on the progressive left in this country. It's also in scholarly literature, and I would say the sort of most prominent articulators of this idea in recent years are two behavioral scientists, Nick Chater and George Lowenstein, who wrote a paper that got a ton of attention, and then subsequently just recently a book, in which they go through all different kinds of issues, from climate change to diabetes to income inequality to racism. And they try to show how in each of these areas there has been what they think of a mistake of dedicating too much resource to individual behavior change approaches rather than what they want to call policy change. And a sort of summary of their view is that history shows that the solution to individual frailty in any kind of domain is to change the system, not the individual. In a series of papers, we've tried to intervene on this dialogue, on this debate between changing systems and changing individuals. We started off by writing a paper that was focused specifically on climate change. We wrote another one about moral education and racism. And that's what sort of gave rise to the book, a desire to intervene on this, the setup of this discourse. What we wanted to focus on specifically was the idea that there is a choice here, an either or. One that we think is sort of captured nicely by Keith Payne and Heidi Vuletich, two social psychologists writing in this context about bias. But it's that rather than that we were focused on. And so what we call that in the book is either or thinking. And I'll just give you 3 quick examples of what we mean. So if you're interested, say, in climate change, you might focus on reducing your personal carbon footprint, or you might think that we need a carbon tax or whatever policy lever you think is the right one. If you're interested in obesity or diabetes, maybe you think the solution is teaching people healthy eating, or maybe you think it's reducing poverty, right? Or whatever you think the structural determinants of the obesity epidemic might be. Or if you're interested in misinformation, you can see this debate unfolding now about whether the solution is teaching something like digital literacy, or whether it's regulating social media companies. And in all of those cases, we want to push back against either or thinking. And I'll just say one quick thing about why, although we go into many more reasons in the book, and then Dan is going to elaborate more. I want to give this woman some love, right? I get the reason for sort of laughing at the idea of somebody fastidiously separating the 2 different parts of their contact lens, disposable things, or whatever it is, and thinking that that makes some material difference to climate change. What else? What can she do, right? What can she do about Jeff Bezos's wedding, or the fossil fuel industry, or the global energy infrastructure? She's doing what she can, right? And we don't want to end up in our thinking about social change thinking that the message we give people, or the message we imbibe ourselves, is that what we can do on the individual level is essentially ineffective, whereas the real things we need to worry about, changing laws and institutions and systems and structures, is something remote, abstract, not in your own personal life. Because that's an incredibly demotivating place to be, right? If the message is what you can do doesn't matter and the real sources of the problem are just way beyond you, then people will rationally and logically conclude, well, I guess then I can't do anything about anything. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Dan now, and he's going to talk about the next section.
Great, thanks, Mike. All right, so the book is structured into, it's got 14 short, easy bite-sized chapters, but it's structured into 3 different parts, and each part has a different sort of main aim. So Michael just told you a little bit about what I think the main aim of the first part is, which is in a lot of ways diagnostic. It's setting up this puzzle, it's showing how this kind of framework of either or thinking structures the way we think about social change and how we can connect up with it, and how we're sort of awash in this framework, which is very natural, but which has also been foisted upon us by dark forces with capitalist agendas and things like that. But then as we move into the second and really the third parts of the book, the aim becomes a little bit more positive, less diagnostic and more creative. And what we're trying to do there is knit together these 2 different sets of concepts, the more individualistic focused ones and the more structural focused ones, way to think about factors, way to think about influences, into packages of ideas which have what we think of as a both-and structure. So especially in the second part of the book where we start the constructive side, we're drawing largely on state-of-the-art research from across the cognitive, behavioral, and social sciences. We're 3 philosophers, but we're also 3 philosophers who share a kind of, I think about it in terms of disciplinary vagabond sensibility. We're just sort of, transgressing boundaries between traditional disciplines and doing this kind of integrative project. And so the way that we're doing it here is trying to develop more symbiotic, like I said, both and ways of thinking about and addressing a host of social challenges. And really in the book, the 2 main ones that we keep returning to, we talk a lot about different social challenges, but the 2 ones that we keep returning to are climate change and systemic racism, sort of these problems which, once you really understand how thorny and huge they are, can feel overwhelming if you don't have useful ways to think about them. And one of the first things we do in the second part of the book is trying to develop some ways to think not just about social change, but to think about people, to think about individuals themselves in a way which highlights more of the both and aspects, more of the social connections that we as individuals bear to each other. Oops, wrong way. Down. Okay. So one last, maybe it's a diagnostic tool here, but a nice way to think about this, the challenges of thinking in both and terms, we use the I don't know if it's a visual illusion, but this very famous image of a duck rabbit has a venerable history in philosophy. So Ludwig Wittgenstein made a big deal about this in the last century. But a lot of people thinking about social change have sort of arrived at this as a useful heuristic, where it's just, okay, so there's these debates between whether or not individuals are primary or more important for thinking about social change, or whether structures are primary or more important for thinking about it. And what we want to say is those debates are in a very similar way, anyway, they're as misguided as having a debate over whether or not this image is really a duck or a rabbit. So I hope everyone can see it in both aspects. So if it's a rabbit, that's the nose and those are the ears. My mom can't see that. I had to walk her through how to see it in terms of the rabbit. But you can imagine a couple of people arguing about whether or not the image is really a duck or really a rabbit. And we think it's just kind of confused that this thing here, it's static, but what it really is a duck rabbit. And what you can do is look at it under one aspect. And what that's going to do is highlight certain features of it. It's going to bring certain aspects into focus and push other ones into the background. It's gonna allow you to see the relationships between the aspects in different ways. And if you flip from the duck to the rabbit, then what was the foreground, or what were some of the more focal points of the image are going to fall into the background, and you're gonna see the relations between the different parts in different ways. You're going to focus on different ones, but the image itself, again, stays the same. All the parts are connected in one set of ways, and we can focus on one rather than the other. And again, debating which one is the right way to look at it, or which features are whether or not those are really ears or really rabbit. Really ears or really a bill. It's just a sort of misunderstanding what's going on in this case. And we think that that's, it's a nice way to think about these debates about social change between individual and structural factors. That debate is just as confused. But we try and show that. So saying sort of in the abstract, that of course, anytime you're thinking about one of these issues or social change more generally, that of course both individual factors and systemic factors are important. That's sort of easy to say in the abstract, and you see people say that all the time. But almost immediately they fall back into either or thinking and really emphasize, or the way they talk at least implicitly implies that they think one set of factors is really more important than the other ones. So what we try and do is, rather than just give sort of lip service to the idea in general, we try and illustrate again and again and again with the stories that we tell throughout the book, and we try and build up a set of concepts, really extract a set of concepts and use the stories to illustrate them as we move through these second and third parts of the book, to show how social change is always this combination of individual factors and social structures. So some of the ideas that we talk about here really focus on social norms, social identities and communities, and the way that those allow people, individuals, to sort of bind together into something greater than the sum of their parts, the way social movements unfold, and how collectives can join together around a cause in various ways, which changes the way they psychologically think about what they're doing, and highlight the way that social roles and institutional positions that individuals occupy can be leveraged in different ways to help bring about social change and amplify social influence. And a lot of what all this is doing is just illustrating all kinds of ways, the more individual aspects of that social, that sort of feedback loop illustrated right there. It's just always sort of a cycling set of influences between individual agents and social structures. So I said before, one of the things that we do early on in this second part of the book is try and build up a picture of humans as individuals, which is much more amenable to this kind of both and package of ideas that we illustrate. One of the nice sort of epithets would capture this idea. It comes from Iris Murdoch. She's a philosopher, also a novelist, who put it very nicely, sort of concisely: man is a creature who makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble the picture. So there's a sense in which humans are influenced by the way they think about themselves, or the concepts that they use to self-interpret, shape their sense of the possibilities for actions. So again, there's a little bit of diagnosis here, a little bit of making explicit this implicit picture, which we're just sort of soaked in, especially here in the West and especially here in the United States. A very individualistic picture of human beings, of individuals. It's very influential. It tends to depict us or invite us to think of ourselves as atomized, as sort of isolated from other humans, as driven by self-interest. And we think there's a mounting case that it's just misleading. Maybe it's crystallized in a lot of our theories as what's been called homo economicus. That's the way a lot of formal mathematical theories in the social sciences conceive of individuals. There's a sense in which that message, or that kind of image of what a human is, finds exceedingly ripe ground here in the United States, where our secular scripture really lionizes values like rugged individualism and self-reliance, really focuses on the self. But that is the end point of a long story about how thinking about individuals has been increasingly atomistic for the last couple of centuries, coming out of the Enlightenment and the rise of capitalism in a lot of ways. So what we try and do here is sketch, like I said, a better picture of individuals, which is rooted in our sort of wheelhouse. We're Westerners, and we're also mainly philosophers of mind and the social sciences, so we're drawing on a lot of trends that we see happening across the cognitive and behavioral sciences. But we also point to places that you can find this strand of thought across a lot of different historical traditions, a lot of different philosophies. I have a picture of Lindauer McWhorter, a feminist philosopher's recent book called Unbecoming Persons, which I just finished reading a couple weeks ago and I'm happy to recommend. But she's walking a very similar path. She's driven by a lot of the same anxieties. How can we as individuals affect the sort of huge corporations and social problems that we seem to be saddled with? And she goes a different route. She uses a different set of skills, but she is also in the business of trying to articulate what it is to be an individual in a way which kind of can help us think about social change and escape this kind of atomizing picture that we've been bequeathed with. So our focus, unlike hers, is on, like I said, a lot of the contemporary sciences. One of the stories we tell here to help dislodge and replace that image of humans as extremely individualistic and self-interested comes from a famous anecdote from Mothers and Others. That's a book by a primatologist, Sarah Hrdy. The story itself has, I think it's escaped its original source. I've heard people tell this in a number of different venues. But like I said, she's a primatologist, and she's getting on an airplane. And she tells the story of how she's getting jostled by people as they're walking by with their two big backpacks, and there's babies crying and someone just farted, and how terrible this experience is of having 200 humans fit into a little cylinder and have to deal with each other in very close quarters. And then she imagines what the same situation would be like if, instead of humans fitting into this particular context, it was 200 chimpanzees who were trying to fit into the same airplane cylinder. And she's like, we think it's bad the way we sort of have to deal with this. The chimps would just be going to town on each other. The plane would land, there would be dead babies. They would have bitten off each other's fingers. They just don't have the same kind of social tolerance that we do. They don't have the same sort of cooperative apparatus that we do. They don't have the same sorts of ultra-social nature that we do, even though they're our closest living relatives. So something's happened to human nature which makes us much more interconnected with each other than, like I said, even our closest non-human relatives. So human nature is ultra-social in ways that we can easily overlook if we're sort of hypnotized by that atomistic Homo economicus picture of humans. And human minds are also extremely cultural. So we are malleable in the face of social influence in ways which are basically unseen in other parts of nature. So another one of the stories that we tell here to illustrate this idea comes from Joe Henrich's 2015 book, The Secret of Our Success. And he tells a story about Sir John Franklin and his expedition trying to chart the Northwest Passage. I think that's up in Canada, which left in 1845. Had a couple of ships equipped with at that time, absolute pinnacle of technology of the West. They had icebreakers, and they had planned to be locked in the ice for a winter and had the provisions to survive that, which they did. And then they got locked in the ice again the next winter, which they hadn't planned for, and didn't have the provisions to make it out. And eventually, by 1848, all of the people on that expedition had died in this sort of seemingly unforgiving tundra of an environment. And the irony here is, while they had what seemed like the pinnacle of modern technology, if anyone was going to be able to survive there, you would think it would be them. At the same time, there was the Netslik Eskimo tribes had been living there comfortably for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years, because they had built up a different kind of technology and had a different set of norms and had a different set of wherewithal and extremely habitat-specific knowledge about how to live in exactly the environment that the Franklin expedition just couldn't survive for even a couple of years. So humans, again, extremely culturally dependent, and that makes us plastic in all kinds of different ways. So part of what we're doing here as we tell these stories and gather together this sort of trend that we're pointing to in the cognitive and behavioral sciences is putting a lens on it, trying to think through what this tells us about our capacity for social change when it comes to things like, structural racism, climate change, all these other social problems that we're trying to address these days. And one of the main themes that we pull out here is that humans are both extremely sensitive to social influence, but we're also constantly emitting social influence as well. There's an active side to this. And so one way to think about that is humans are not just sort of receptacles of change, we are also agents of change. We are naturally agents of change. And so getting a little bit clearer on the machinery that makes us agents of change in this way would ideally, and what we try and do in the rest of the book, is show us how to harness all of those different capacities that we have. Social influence is the water that we swim through. It's ubiquitous. It allows us to do what we do, even if it sort of escapes notice because it's so much a part of our everyday lives. Pull that out, make it a little bit more explicit, figure out how to harness it.
I think you're going the wrong way.
I am going the wrong way, but I'm pushing the old button. There it is. Okay, so Michael's going to tell you about some more specific examples here. Here's one way to just initially out of the gates illustrate that point about how we are agents of change in ways that probably we don't fully appreciate all the time. So think of any individual action that you might take as a person, any decision that you might make to do, change to solar panels on your house, spend a couple 20, 25 minutes every morning picking up trash in your neighborhood or on a beach that you love, quitting smoking, any individual choice you can make to change your behavior in the direction of what you consider better behavior or moral progress. You can separate out 3 different vectors of influence that change or the behavior that you're adopting is going to send out into the world. So one of them is going to be the direct material consequences. If you decide to stop driving your car to work and instead biking every day, what that's going to do is help your own personal carbon footprint. You're going to have a little bit less influence on how much carbon you're emitting into the environment, and so how much you're contributing to global climate change. Great, probably just a drop in a bucket. But what you're also doing is sending out social signals to other people, which represent what you value, that you're willing to make this change in your life, that you're willing maybe to accept whatever inconveniences are, or whatever weird looks you're going to get from your neighbors, given that you value climate change and that you're willing to make these changes, not value climate change, you value having a cleaner climate, and you're willing to make these changes in your life in the service of those values. You're advertising in a sense. And then in a lot of ways, the most interesting one that for me to think about as we've moved through this has been the influence you're sort of having via these signals you're sending to yourself, right? So if you're willing, if you adopt one of these changes, or if you put on, take the inconvenience or assume the financial burden of putting solar panels on top of your house, that might change the way you think about yourself and change the way you think about what you're willing to do in the service of something that you care about. And that might be the first step into a new kind of identity or a new kind of potential that you might apply in different directions as you move forward in your own life. You're always creating yourself as you go, and this is one way you can do it. All right, so like I said, we're pulling together a lot of different ideas from across the social and behavioral sciences to break down these old ways of thinking. And coming from that Iris Murdoch quote that I started with, one of the best ways or most useful ways for me to think about what we're doing in this book is we're trying to open up people's moral imagination on how they think about social change and their place in it. And that's been especially useful because there's a lot of things that the book isn't. It's not a how-to manual. We're not activists first and foremost. And so talking about the stuff with activists, we're not telling them how they should be doing their particular job. It's not really a recipe for political revolution. We're thinking in terms of incremental changes. We're also not policy wonks, so we're not making particular policy recommendations. And we're not, despite Michael's shout out to Marx earlier, we're not sort of providing a grand historical narrative or a big theory of change, maybe about the secret motors of history or something like that. Instead, what the book is it's trying to break up some old entrenched patterns of thought, reframe social change using some better concepts, and expand our moral imagination. So I think I've said most of this before. One of the things that was really at the forefront of our minds as we were writing this was this idea of political hobbyism, which is a kind of trap that people can fall into, maybe especially academics or people who are keeping up with the news on a toxic basis, maybe, where you can feel extremely engaged. You can feel like you're doing something really important by knowing exactly what's happening in the House of Representatives, or keeping really close tabs and arguing with people about the news of the day on social media. You can feel like you're doing something. You can feel like you're getting worked up. You can feel affectively connected to what's happening, but you're not actually doing something. You're just treating politics as a kind of hobby rather than taking action, making changes to your life, doing something which is going to actually have a chance of leveraging the kinds of social influence that we all have. So we're showcasing ideas from the behavioral and cognitive sciences. Here's a list of the different concepts, if any of those look familiar or are interesting to you. We go into detail and try and illustrate them with a number of stories throughout the second and third part of the book. And I think Michael's going to take over from here and do a little bit of that work.
Okay, so the last third of the book is meant to be practical, applicable, lessons you can take into your life to effectuate the things that you care about. And I'm just going to summarize some of the things we talk about. Like Dan said a few times, the book is very based in stories, often historical events from people who have tried to make changes in their world. So what I'm going to focus on are what we'll call structure-facing virtues. So these are excellences, or what we call in a paper, dispositions to notice and act upon situational influences of our minds in order to make the world a better place. Anyone recognize her? So this is Funmilayo Kuti. She's the mother of Fela Kuti. You may have heard of him, sort of the father of Afrobeat music. And in her day, she was actually more well-known than her son came to be. So in colonial Nigeria, she was born into a well-to-do family, always kind of a do-gooder, and wanted to figure out how to make the lives of people in her area better. And so in 1932, she formed the Abeokuta Ladies Club, and it taught local village women skills, self-improvement skills is what she called them, sewing skills, ways to market goods, and so on. But over time, what she came to see more and more were the pervasive injustices of the colonial system that she actually herself had kind of been born into benefiting from. She got radicalized, is another way of saying it. And in 1946, she changed the club into the Abeokuta Women's Union, which focused on women's suffrage and independence, both of which she nearly lived to see. So she lived through Nigerian independence, and she was tragically killed by government troops a year before women gained universal suffrage in Nigeria, incredibly, in 1979. The point of the story that we bring out, and let me just say, by the way, if you're a podcast fan, Jad Abumrad from Radiolab did like a 9-part series on Fela Kuti, and there's one episode in there about her, and it's terrific. The moral of the story that we draw here is about the importance of what we call seeing structures, right? So this is that first step of getting beyond thinking that like all we need to do to address climate change is each of us mind our personal carbon footprints, right? We live within a very complex energy system, and if that's the issue you're concerned about, it's very important to know about that system and how it works. Or if you're interested in trying to create more racial justice in the world, understanding the history, the laws, the institutions, and the economies that prop up racial inequity, you have to know about that stuff. But it's not enough to just know about it. And so I'm going to move on from that in one second. But before I do, let me just say how to bring this into our contemporary lives, because maybe you don't want to be a revolutionary who loses their life by being thrown out of the window by government troops like Funmilayo Kuti. So suppose you're just interested in something banal like bicycle commuting. How do we see structures in order to create change? Bike commuting is good, right? And bike lanes are an important part of it because nobody wants to feel like they're taking their life into their hands by riding their bike to work. So you could get stuck in a kind of either or framework, by thinking that you have two options, right? You could either like just ride safely yourself, taking the world for like as fixed, right? You either got bike lanes or you don't. Or you could say, well, I'm not responsible for city infrastructure, and I'm not going to ride my bike until better infrastructure exists because I don't want to do something unsafe. And so I'm just going to say like, well, we need to change the system. We need better bike lanes. I think an alternative would be to think about or imbibe in your own life or teach people how safe cycling relies upon cycling infrastructure, and also how to petition your city government or where you live to create it. Right? So the reason I frame this as a both and approach is that it is giving you as an individual something to do. You are indeed taking responsibility for trying to help solve that problem. It's not just saying, don't worry about individuals, change the system. But you're redirecting your attention from your own personal bicycling behavior to that system itself, right? And what you can do about it, right? So the point here is this is a way of seeing structures that I think is analogous to what Funmilayo Kuti was doing in her time. But as I said before, it's not enough to just see structures. You have to understand them and have a correct understanding of how they work. And so in the book, we illustrate this by turning to some of the developmental psychology literature on how kids imbibe social inequalities from a shockingly young age, right? So basically from when they're born, kids are picking up patterns about the world around them, as this Richard Sadler photograph, I think, nicely conveys, right? With all the black nannies and the white kids. But not all kids come to understand those systems and patterns the same way, right? Some kids grow up to think, well, this is the natural order of things. And some kids grow up to think there's something unjust about this. And so this is an opportunity for creating social change as parents, right? Because there's lots of evidence that parents' attitudes towards race have big effects on their kids. Parents' comfort with existing social hierarchies predict their kids' prejudices, their preferences for what kinds of groups they're parts of, their charitableness to groups that they don't see themselves as parts of. But it's not enough to know that structures exist and need to be changed, and it's not enough to have a correct understanding of them. You also have to see them as changeable, as not immutable and fixed forevermore. So to illustrate this point, I want to point to probably the most sort of pervasively out there individual intervention in schools, growth mindset. So I assume that lots of you have heard of this idea, right? The idea of a growth mindset is that you can teach kids to see important traits like musical ability or intelligence or whatever it is as learnable, right? It's the opposite of thinking that you either have it or you don't. There's lots of criticism of growth mindset interventions, because it's not clear that if we try to just tell kids to adopt them or try to teach them in various ways, that it works. One version of that criticism is that it's too individualistic, right? That effectively what we're doing is saying, we can't change the environment, we can't make schools better, so we're just going to try to get individual kids to be better off by adopting growth mindsets. But we wanted to, in the book, try to provide what we think is like a both and alternative that gets what's right out of this, but looks at it in a broader sense. So one way of seeing that is that there's interesting literature suggesting that growth mindset interventions are more powerful when the people teaching them, teachers usually, themselves have growth mindsets about their pupils, right? When they believe that their kids can actually change and learn and improve, the outcomes are more predictively positive. And the way that we would frame this is that the teachers are being the environment, are being the system, so to speak, or the situation for those kids, right? And that's a sort of both and-y way of seeing it. In addition, people can cultivate growth mindsets toward social institutions and arrangements, right? Not just toward themselves and their own abilities, but to the world itself. Fourth, though, it's not enough to just know about systems and structures and understand them and see them as changeable, but also be willing to actually go out and do the work of creating social change. And so for this part of the book, what we were interested in trying to find was evidence for what motivates people to get out and actually try to make a difference. And so this is a huge literature, and there's lots that's already known. But what we thought would be interesting was to think about where do we see evidence that people kind of overcome a kind of bias toward justifying the status quo, where they get over this challenge of thinking, well, things are as they are, and what can I do about it? And so we looked for individual differences in people's willingness to challenge the status quo. And one place where we found really interesting work was in the research by social psychologist Aaron Ayanian, who went around in the 2010s and interviewed people who attended protests in real high-risk situations. So she went to Egypt during the Arab Spring, which is where this picture is from. She went to Hong Kong. She went to Russia. And what she found was that people who attended and were sort of active participants in protests, when they're, they were putting themselves on the line, did not have unusually strong beliefs in their own agency to bring about the ends that they sought, right? And you might think that might be surprising, like, because why go if you're not convinced that you can make a difference to the outcome? But what she did find they had really unusually strong beliefs in was their ability to make a difference to the other people who were there at the protest, right? They said things like, if I show up, I might be able to help my neighbor stay safe, right? Or I might be able to keep my friend who brought me to the protest safe, right? And this is another way of talking about solidarity, right? They had unusually strong beliefs in solidarity, and they thought, even if like the movement might not make all the difference, I can make a difference to the movement. And what was really striking is this replicates findings from another discipline. So there's a famous paper in political science from Doug McAdam looking at the Mississippi Freedom Riders. And what he did was compare two groups of people, people who signed up to go on freedom rides and went, to people who signed up and didn't show up. And by doing that, he's sort of weeding out the people who don't care enough, or the people who disagree with the ends or whatever. And what he found was that the major difference between the no-shows and the people who actually went were that the people who actually went had many more social ties to other people who went. They had a whole, what he called, social infrastructure that supported getting them there, right? They were members of groups, and they had informal social networks. And I think in a contemporary context, we're seeing this same lesson again in Minnesota during the ICE raids, where there was this explosion of mutual aid groups and people showing up because they were saying things like, this might be my neighbor or the guy at the deli that I get a coffee from, or whatever, but I'm there because my friend asked me to come, and I'm there because somebody I know down the street needs me. So the lesson we draw here is that one of the most powerful motivators to be willing to fight for social change is having these social ties to other people in that effort. Dan talked a little bit about this, so I'm just going to try to go quickly through it. But a fifth lesson that we talk about in the book is a willingness to just talk about what we care about. You might think of virtue signaling as a kind of negative thing, and there's lots of kind of gross examples of it. Maybe that's your reaction to this one, when the congressional Dems were kneeling in the Capitol during Black Lives Matter wearing kente cloth. But I think there's lots of other examples where people's willingness to say out loud and in public what they care about is incredibly important. And it builds on the points Dan was making about how radically social and interconnected we are. So I want to just show a video that's 50 seconds of a kid trying to learn a task. So this is a slight deviation into developmental psychology again. The point that I'm going to try to make is the one that Dan was pointing to about how radically social we are. So here we go. Okay, so, oh, sorry. Okay. What stands out to someone about what the kid does when he's following the directions of the adult about how to get the toy out? Someone maybe who doesn't know this literature already. Anyone want to guess? So the guy shows the kid a series of steps, right? And then the kid imitates him, right? Anything about those steps seem odd? So I'll just give it to you. So some of the things that the grown-up does are completely meaningless, right? So did you see when he's got the stick and he like inserts it a few times and then he taps on the side, right? Really all the guy needed to do was take the stick out of the side and slide the thing open and then you get the toy, right? What does the kid do? The kid does every single step that the grown-up showed him, right? This is evidence of what people call over-imitation. This is how human beings learn. If you do this exact same thing with chimpanzees, they just take the stick and they open the box, right? They just go straight for the thing that they want. They skip the meaningless steps. The point is, from birth, we are looking at each other, trying to figure out how to make sense of the world, right? That's how we as humans have succeeded, is by being so radically socially exposed. The point that we take, and here I'm going to try to bring this back to the whole story, is that if we are over-imitators, we are also all, each of us, the over-imitated, right? And that is this opportunity, again, to be an entrepreneur of social change, to be someone that other people learn from. So I want to switch tracks now and sort of flesh out a little bit how we mean that. We got this great example from Bob Frank's book, Under the Influence, where he talks about why laws against secondhand smoking are really powerful, right? And so you might think that the reason why it's beneficial to ban smoking in restaurants is because, like, if someone else is smoking and you're in the restaurant and you don't want to smoke, like, it prevents you from inhaling the smoke, right? That seems intuitive. Frank's point is that the real benefit of laws against secondhand smoke is that it prevents more smokers. When people smoke in public, it normalizes smoking, right? It makes it seem like something we here around here do. And so the real public health benefit of these laws is not that it protects the people in the restaurant, it's that it reduces smoking rates overall. And Frank draws out this lesson with lots of examples, one of which is smoking and the effects of just our social relationships on it, right? People are 24% more likely to quit when their sibling quits, 36% more likely to quit when a friend quits, 67% more likely to quit when a spouse quits, right? That is peer influence. Right? And we can see the same lessons across all kinds of things. So Dan nodded at the importance of solar panels, which I'll talk about in a sec, but I forgot that I had this example here, which is about voting, right? And the effects of college roommates on voting, which is commensurate to the effect of parents on their kids, right? So again, if there are students here who have roommates, right? Your choice to vote is not just one tick in the tally, but it is a sort of social shot in the atmosphere. The point about solar panels is that you might think the best way to predict who puts panels on their roof is like the cost or the ease of getting an installer or whatever. It is actually whether there are panels on your neighbor's roof, right? So there's all kinds of interesting research on peer influence on solar diffusion, right? And so that's that same point again, our power as social individuals to signal our virtue, to signal the things we care about, to create systemic change. Dan talked about this difference between material influence and social influence, so I'll kind of just skip over this, but the takeaway is, again, to think of ourselves as the situation that is shaping other people's choices. Okay, and the last thing I'll say is just that where we kind of land at the end of the book is on the importance of thinking of ourselves as having social roles and using those roles as leverage points for creating structural change. So I talked about how important it is to learn about laws and institutions and social systems and how they affect us. I talked about identifying skills-based approaches to changing collective practices. And so the conclusion is about looking in our own individual lives for the roles we can play to help create transformative change. So I talked about somebody like Funmilayo Kuti, who identified a role that she could play. But the book is sort of rife with stories of people who found roles to create meaningful change, not all of which we agree with. I want to be clear. So the guy in the white hat is Harlan Carter, who was the genius behind the National Rifle Association's strategy for cultivating a social identity around gun ownership. And he transformed the NRA from a hobbyist group for people who like target shooting to one of the most powerful legislative organizations in the country. We talk about Janice Leitner, whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver and ended up starting Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which went from, in about 25 years, an organization of 3 people to one of the most recognized citizen action groups in American history. Something like 95% of people have heard of it. They were instrumental in changing the national drinking age. And also, again, equally crucially, shifting norms around drunk driving, right? We talk about Chris Smalls, the guy who was working as a picker at an Amazon facility in Staten Island, who was fired for protesting the lack of protective gear during COVID and decided to try to organize a union and ended up being the person to first organize an Amazon warehouse in the country. And what we draw out from his story is the importance of face-to-face organization. So he and his co-organizers talked a lot about how they found little value in the group chats and the Facebook pages and whatever. And what they did was they just had a table in the break room every day and talked to people about what their concerns were and what their frustrations were. And they ended up having this massively successful unionization effort. So I'll just end with the thought that all of us have all kinds of social roles. And I think all of those roles offer us opportunities to try to be agents of change. And with that, we'll just say thanks and hopefully take your questions.
Yeah, so we do also, as part of this, have responses from Ray Block and Matt Lindauer, who you heard earlier. So in terms of the timing, I think, did you have slides, Ray, or did you just want to, and for you, Matt, we could potentially do it like we just did for the previous panel. If all of you wanted to come up here, I can get one more chair. There actually are 4 chairs there, perfect. And if you, let's see, about 20 minutes. If you each wanted to give short remarks, and then Michael and Dan, if you have any responses, and then we'll close with some questions from the audience.
So I'll be short. This is amazing work. And I'm going to start by leveling how I see this stuff. I am seeing this as an academic who also works in think tanks. So it's clear that practice, in air quotes, and theory, in air quotes, need each other. That's clear from all of the presentations that we saw today. I think also what y'all are saying is that academia needs non-academia too. And so all of the social movement related social organizing examples keep bringing this point home. And I want to emphasize, especially for the somebody do something piece, that political organizing is transformational. Social organizing is transformational. Diva Woodley, who was at the New School previously, now at Brown, would talk about how the difference between organizing and mobilizing is you get people together to get something accomplished, and mobilizing. Organizing is turning people into activists, convincing people that they're the kind of people that can get something done if something needs to be done. The book, to me, is an organizing project. And I'm saying that in the most complimentary possible way. Like, it's getting at this idea that society and individuals are really in a conversation with each other. It's not an either or thing, obviously, but also that people can feel like they can get things done. People can feel like they can get things done thinking system-wide about what's happening and actually being empowered with their dissatisfaction about how things are to get something accomplished. I just feel like that's inherently important. And I want to thank you for putting this thing together. And to the degree that it helps, you have kindred spirits in the organizing literature, especially the organizing literature that looks at what they call highly aspirational movements. For example, the Christian nationalist movement, regardless of whether you like it, is a highly aspirational movement with a multi-generational goal and very distinct ideas about how feasible or not things are going to happen. And any problem that's as wicked as that is the kind of thing that I think your book speaks to. Problems that are really hard and have lots of moving parts to them, that are very confusing and that the rules can change from day to day, are the kinds of mobilizing/organizing problems that people can be demotivated from. And books like yours help us to think about how we can actually do that kind of work.
I'm going to do the philosopher thing and throw out a bunch of points, and they're not meant as objections, but more invitations to elaborate, and we'll see. So I cite this work. I obviously think very highly of it. One thing that you didn't mention is just if someone poo-poos recycling or eating more plant-based food or doing other things that, don't solve the problem all by themselves, one thing you could say is there's expressive significance. Like when I recycle, I'm expressing the attitude that I care about this thing. And that leads to a second point, which is that it seems like in some ways the individual domain in your approach is kind of instrumentalized to the structural. Take individual action for the sake of the structural. But another thing to talk about, which, I think you actually, this is more just being a philosopher, but like, what kind of person am I? Am I the kind of person who does, just throws litter on the garbage, on the truck? That's another kind of moral consideration. It's a bit, and it is very individualistic, and there's not all individualism is bad. So the third thing is like the more kind of critical thing, which is just that I wonder if you've actually, you could call this both a both and approach. You could also say that you're inviting people to reject atomic individualism and reconceive the whole thing as structural, right? So the individual is part of a structure. In a sense, it's not both and. In a sense, it's really seeing yourself not as merely an individual. And I just, maybe we want to retain for some practical reasons an individual domain and a structural domain. But I take it that most people who are critical of responsibilism are people who are quite involved in collective action. And it's not that they don't do the individual actions that are part of collective action. It's just that they want the kind of reinterpretation of what it means to be an individual that you're precisely calling for in an important way. And then the last thing that I just would ask you to, this is just all invitations to say more, is whether or not emphasizing the pointlessness of certain kinds of individual action could actually be valuable. Like when you're motivating people to get involved in a social movement or like the movement for climate change, you could say, look, you might want to recycle that coffee pod or something like that for reasons that are important. But really, unless you do those other things, this is pointless. And I didn't know if you wanted people ever to poo-poo individual action or just to do it in a more careful way. Okay, that's it.
Is that on? Now it is. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. I'll just say really quickly, we could get into fights about prioritizing individualism and structuralism and so on. I guess I would say another way of framing the project broadly is that when evaluating choices about what I ought to do, I think the familiar way of thinking is in what Dan and I were calling material terms, right? Like, how many pounds of greenhouse gases am I going to save when I do X? Or what kind of dent in the obesity epidemic can I make if I do Y? And the point isn't that there are not things that are useless to do, but it's to change the criteria by which we evaluate them. And so I don't like, it's not bad to think about how much carbon dioxide I'm going to save when I bike rather than drive. But I want to suggest that there's an additional kind of a question that I can ask, which is, who else can I influence? Who am I in a position to be in communication with, or maybe even a little bit more powerfully, who am I in a position to be in community with in trying to make the world a better place? But there's a flip side set of questions, which is what are the institutions, what are the laws, what are the systems that we want to create? And a different set of evaluative criteria for those might be, how well do they enable individuals to try to enact their values or make the world a better place? And so the way I think we kind of keep coming back to the relationship between the two in the book is as sort of flip sides of one coin rather than as separate kinds of considerations. There's more I could say, but maybe we get questions.
I just wanted to say thanks for the idea of looking closer at Christian nationalism. I think that's a terrific case study that we could sort of sink our teeth into. I had been thinking earlier that, and maybe this is connected, but I obviously have to do my homework on it. But the success of the Federalist Society in the United States, another one of these like very long time horizon structural projects, which is obviously connected to a lot of Christian nationalist ideas. But like, how did they pull off what they pulled off would be another really interesting case study.
Thank you. Really fascinating project. And Daryl, great to position this following on from the previous book. I think they're in conversation with each other in really interesting ways. I think I don't disagree, I think, with a lot of where you end up, but I just want to push back against some of where you started. So, I'm somebody who wrote a book about the corporate influence of many companies, including the food industry. And, another way of putting it is their bottom line depended on you never seeing the rabbit. You had to only see the duck. You had to only see that it was individual responsibility. It's your fault. And of course, the reality we know is that people didn't become less disciplined in their eating habits. The food system changed in fundamental ways. Kellogg's and Post subtly competed with each other by adding more and more sugar to their cereal. So cereal became more sugary over time, and people didn't realize that because it happened gradually. So I think that's what. So I think those, including myself, who critiqued responsibilization, weren't saying it's either or. I think in the chorus of it's your individual responsibility, a chorus reinforced by public-private partnerships with industry, in the chorus, we were saying, hold on a minute, there's something else going on here, and you need to pay attention. So that's the thing I think I would push back on just a little. But then to get to your somebody should do something, which I think is a wonderful title for a book, and I think it's a great project. Thinking of Iris Marion Young's work on responsibility for injustice, I think there are different things that different somebodies should be doing. And I wonder if you want to speak to that, that if you are the somebody who's a janitor working for Exxon, you're in a very different position than if you are the CEO or the board of directors or a shareholder of Exxon. So do you want to elaborate perhaps on do you distinguish in your 6 ways how they might play out for different people with different power, social status, responsibility, resources, access, and the like?
Maybe I'll say something quick on the criticism, and then I have a feeling I know where you're going to go on the. Yeah. So just on the pushback, I mean, I don't actually think I disagree with what you were saying, unless I'm not quite getting it. But the way you described the history sounds exactly right to me. The way, though, that I would argue that the sort of individual side of it matters is that history of responsibilizing of corporate PR and so on found a very willing audience in Americans who think of themselves in very individual terms. And it's not obvious that whole play would have worked with in a different culture, with people with a different set of expectations or self-conceptions or so on. And so I'm of the view, I guess, that both like in a explanatory framework in terms of understanding human action, it is always both, and it's an interactive story about persons and situations. What I think and I have nothing new to say about that. Like there's a century of theorizing about it that is great. I think if we're trying to do something new, it's try to talk about that relation of individuals and structural change when we ask the question, well, how do I make the world a better place? What do I do in a forward-looking sort of a sense? But so that's the way the history part that you told, like I would want to assimilate it into the story we have. Now about the roles and like the lessons for people who are situated differently.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer to that question that as you asked it is, yeah, we do talk about that and try and, especially in the end of the book, our 14th chapter, the last chapter, is fighting from where you stand. And Michael showed that one slide, which I think had like 16 or 20 different social roles that any one person could occupy at the same time. And part of the sort of idea that chapter is a culmination of is that just getting people aware not only of like their capacity to see social structures and understand them and intervene on them is also understanding like what node they occupy in these different social structures and what capacities they have to take whatever social influence they have and maximize their bang for their buck, to amplify their social influence through the institutions that they live in. And one of the ideas that we pull from an occupational psychologist at Penn, Amy Wishnitsky, she has this idea of job crafting, which is she sort of profiles people in their understanding of what they do and how they might come to understand not just the very specific tasks that their job gives them, but how they sit in a larger institution such that they can not just reconceive of, what the larger outcomes they're contributing to, but how they can take their job and shape it in ways which amplify influence in different directions. And so we have a number of different cases of people doing exactly this sort of thing, given their social roles. In other versions of this that I've presented, especially one I gave at Purdue, I do a little toast to one of my friends there he sort of had this, come to Jesus moment about climate change. He didn't care about it for a really long time. And then he read David Wallace Wells' book and sort of, he woke up to climate change. And then without he told me this in retrospect, he thought through, how can I start taking steps to make an effect, to have an influence on climate change, given that I'm a professor in an English department at a Big Ten university. And so he thought very systematically, can I try and do something at the state, like the federal level? Can I do something at the state level? And what he decided was, given my job and my skill set, I can help the students at Purdue organize in such a way that they can put pressure on that administration to commit to getting down to carbon zero within 5 years or something. And like now he's the head of an organization of students with 1,000 kids in it, and he like runs the meetings and everything, and they're in discussions with the president. And it's just a great example of someone, again, what can I do given what levers of power are within my reach?
letting me skip you. I appreciate it. My question was about the social structures and social networks at play. And maybe you go into it in the book, but what is the role of perceived social support, and what are the I'm thinking if I were to stick my neck out for a cause, the first thing I'm going to think about is myself. And so how am I protected and who's going to have my back? So I'm curious about how that fits into the larger, I don't know, the framework of what you guys are saying about social networks and just the role of social support and vulnerability.
Well, I think it's really important. Okay. I think I'm going to try to connect something Dan said to your question, which is about finding your own role in creating change. And that sounds very individualistic in a way that I want to kind of be careful about. I mean, we both say it all the time. Part of the reason of putting it that way is because I think one thing that is a barrier for people to get involved in trying to make the world a better place for whatever the causes are that they care about is that being an activist, I mean, this connects to some of the comments in the beginning, like being an activist or a revolutionary or a protester kind of clouds our imagination sometimes. And it's sort of like, well, if I'm not the kind of person who wants to go scream in the streets, I don't know what I can do, right? What else do I do? I could donate money and what else, right? And so I think that one of the crucial roles of social infrastructure is not just to make us feel safe and supported, although I think that's crucial, but also just to be, to connect back to one of the earlier talks today, happens in classrooms, a kind of laboratory for being creative about things that we can do. And so your friends, your family, your coworkers, whatever, may have ideas that you don't have, or may have ideas that I don't have. Ways of job crafting so that if I am teaching a class and I'm feeling totally down about it and burnt out, some friend of mine might be like, oh, I tried this thing. We did a project where we went outside the classroom and we took the students and we did X, Y, and Z thing, right? And I never would have thought of that. And so I just think that being in community with other people has all these kind of benefits that we don't always predict. And it's where my mind goes when I think about what risks are you asking me to take? Well, I don't want to ask anyone to take any risks that they don't want to take, but I think that isn't a reason to do nothing. Not that you're suggesting it is, right? But the project here is in some ways to be look for the opportunities for ways that are going to populate your mind with ideas that you hadn't come up with on your own.
Thanks for sharing the project. I'm super supportive. I also think a lot of debates, the most accurate answer is both and, but it doesn't get the most attention, unfortunately. So best of luck in getting attention to the book. But one question I had is either in the book or is it something you've thought about is how this connects to debates about authenticity and hypocrisy. So there's some that will argue, like David Runciman, hypocrisy, we care too much about hypocrisy, we focus too much about it. But I also think, another point is that we're all hypocrites, and I think that's true to a certain extent, but there's also better and worse forms of hypocrisy, and I think people are sensitive to that. And how hypocrisy can undermine trying to influence others, and how important authenticity is, and what you found, if that comes up in the book at all.
So I don't think we talk systematically about this stuff in the book, but in a sense, I think for all three of us, the book is one piece of our larger projects, and one of the ones that I've been champing at the bit to get to work on for a while now and have recently started working on was I'm with the people who think authenticity is kind of bullshit, and that we care way too much about hypocrisy, and that we need to chill out about it. And the way I think about where this fits into this kind of picture is, the middle section of the book, I said part of it is going to be to reimagine what individuals are. And we got this comment from Matt as well, that, maybe we should think of ourselves just as like constituents of a system. I think that's unlikely to be fruitful because we are so individualistic here. I don't think that'll get a lot of uptake. But one of the things that's given me, I don't know, hope that there's room to reimagine the way that we think about ourselves is how much my students and people in the larger public are alert to this idea that we all occupy all these different social roles, and that we often have to code switch between them in ways which from the outside can look like being inauthentic, if that's the only lens you have through which to understand social interactions. But again, I think authenticity and this idea that we have one true self that we should carry from one social situation to the next, to the next, to the next, I think that's just gone. And I don't think it's gone. I think that needs to go. And I think it's slowly eroding, but it probably needs flat out saying one thing and doing another. That's gonna keep getting social disapproval for a long time. But I think if people can just kind of get better at and more welcoming of individuals presenting themselves in different ways across different social situations and foregrounding different aspects of themselves across different situations, that's going to be a piece of this puzzle of deconstructing the really individualistic conception of people and replacing it with something a little bit more multifaceted.
All right, so I'll take one last question, and then I have one last super quick question, and then we'll close for the day.
These are a great joint talk, and I just want to piggyback on those last 2 points, because something that came to mind to me when you were speaking about solar panels, and was Gordon Craft Todd's work that was published in Nature in 2018 on credibility enhancing displays, where he finds that like a feature of salespeople for solar panels that works really well is if they themselves have a solar panel installed themselves. And it reminded me also about the work about growth mindset that you were talking about, that if you believe yourself that in a growth mindset, you're more likely to transmit that to the people you're trying to teach it to. And I think I agree that authenticity concerns should matter less. And I think norms and descriptive norms in particular are a really powerful vehicle for social change, especially when combined with strong injunctive norms. And I think that these honest, credibility-enhancing displays are a good way to communicate authenticity, because it still does, I think, matter to a lot of people. And there's a lot of work coming out that shows that people do discount the attribution of virtuous motivations to people who do things in public, even if their true motivations may well be authentic. And it does matter. And I so badly want it to matter less and less. And I think it might not be the biggest hurdle, but one of them. And I think that there are ways to subtly display credibility and authenticity through a combination of the things you talked about in the talk. And I think it's a cool place for further work. Yeah.
So thanks for the vote of confidence. And I agree that this is sort of a locus of a lot of interesting issues for social change writ large. And just to say once again that this book is part of a larger project for a lot of us. Another one that I'm a lot of my work recently, and then the next book that I'll be working on, is about the psychology of norms and how that should inform how we think about norm change, and ideally what people who are the most well-positioned or at least well-constituted to be entrepreneurs of norm change, what they're going to look like and what properties they're likely to have. And we're going to have a chapter in the book on virtue signaling and self-transformation and all of this stuff. So I just totally agree with what you said, that norms are going to be a really key lever for thinking about social change going forward. And that's what I'm interested in thinking about more.
Can I just add one quick thing, which is a detail that I learned after we wrote the book, so it didn't make it in, but it connects up with the sort of question of what's my role. We did an interview with Damon Santola, who does a lot of cool research on social networks, and he pointed out that one of the things he's found is about the importance for sending social signals, given whether you are an expected or an unexpected messenger of that signal, right? And so his example was, it's one thing if you've got one friend who's like constantly telling you about their veganism, right? And it's like easy to discount them because it's like, well, it's just that guy and he's annoying and whatever, right? But if like your dentist and your Republican cousin and your, coworker from across the hall all tell you about their veganism, it like gets your attention in a way because they're unexpected messengers, right? So there's a lesson there, right? Which is asking yourself, like, what can I be an unexpected messenger for in my social network? And so that's not quite the same as authenticity, but it's a different way of thinking about how I can send a credible signal for the things I care about. Totally.
So one last super quick question. It's kind of more of a quick anecdote and then a question to close and try to kind of integrate the different comments in the recent talks. So I remember I was giving a talk last year about empathy and empathy choice, and someone pitched this response to me that was like, when you think about choosing to empathize or do good in the world, she essentially framed it as, in some cases, yes, you can choose to help someone, but oftentimes it's not a matter of your individual choice. It's a matter of empathy as the structure of what surrounds us. And at the time, it really struck me that, how much of my framing of empathy and emotion was fundamentally bound up in this individualized conception. And so one thing I like about your presentation in your book, you're capturing one of these processes of how we manage our emotions, how we select our situations, how we change our emotional scaffolds and environments in a way that, although it can be so effective for us in how we manage ourselves and our feelings, I think it often, at least anecdotally, seems like one of those strategies that is often the most overlooked in terms of how we create our own structures and how others create our structures. And so I like how you're amplifying how others can do that scaffolding for us sometimes. And I guess my question is really, and I think this gets into like the fruitfulness of thinking about interpersonal emotion regulation and situation selection as like a normative move, but also, laboratories of democracy and how we think about valuing those spaces. I guess I would just, to close, how would you think about ways to further highlight and shape and prioritize people thinking about those sometimes invisible, like structural moves that we make to shape our environments?
So one way you might think about it, which picks up this idea that we are each other's social structures, but there's a feedback loop which happens there. So if you want to think about it in terms of social norms, there's a process you can think of as something like a vowel. So let's say I read my Peter Singer, I grew up eating steaks and I read my Peter Singer and I decide, all right, I'm going to become a vegan. That's a really hard set of changes to make in your lifestyle and dietary options. But one way you might do that is, rather than just like closing your eyes and grunting really hard and trying to not eat the marshmallow or the steak or whatever it is you might tell everyone you know that you are going vegan. Just like virtue signal the hell out of it. Because what you're doing, like the way to understand what you're doing there is you are proactively rearranging your social environment, right? You're sort of reorganizing the expectations that other people have of you. And you're also placing reputational bets on all of this stuff. So now your reputation depends on you're living up to these ideals that you're sort of blasting out into the social world. And so doing that is a way that you're like rearranging social expectations, and then that's going to come back and shift your incentives, which is something that can help change your own sort of behavior in exactly the ways that you want to change your behavior. So that's one way to think about this sort of thing.
Can I ask just one follow-up? So how do you deal with, I feel like you see this in response, at least online, to various kinds of collective action movements sometimes. Just the quick dismissal of virtue signaling, which seems like this interestingly a surprisingly rich meta moral move that is happening given the logic of what you're describing.
So the dynamics of that happening online when there's so I think that just scrambles a lot of this stuff, and I don't know how to think about it, and I would if it were up to me I would I would ask Molly Crockett. She knows all about how things happen online, especially with norms and signaling like that. My way of thinking about that is much more if you're like face-to-face social networks and people that you have actual relationships with. In that case, I think they're just wrong. If it's just mere virtue signaling, if what you're doing is like reaching for reputational benefits, but like covertly eating a meat lover's pizza every Friday night, that's terrible. But people like by like announcing this new version of yourself that you want, you're all abort.
Really quickly, because I know we got to go. I was just going to, in some ways, it connects up to the question John asked Matt before about the way in which our normative ideas and moral ideas can be seen as like things we're drawing from our culture and community, right? And I think that a lot of the ideas that we are talking about here about being a norm change entrepreneur, trying to create social change and how to think about it, are ideas that we all grasp, but we like lose the grasp of when we're trying to figure out tangibly what to do. And so I think part of the project is just trying to like make the concepts that we all are familiar with in some contexts more visible in other contexts. And like one obvious way we do that, like sometimes when we've given talks about this, we ask the audience, we talk about voting, and we do this thing where we are like, how many of you have voted in an election where you have cast the deciding vote? Like you've broken the tie. And of course, nobody puts their hand up unless it was in their like 7-person PTA meeting or something, right? And then of course we ask the question, like, how many of you have worn the I voted sticker? And everybody puts their hand up. And then you say, well, why? And everyone immediately knows why, right? Because like they're trying to signal to their community that like voting is an important thing to do and I'm a voter, right? And like, that's a concept for how to think of creating the situation for each other that I think kind of everyone already had, but maybe doesn't have quite the words for. And so to me, that's something that we can constantly strive to do to like proliferate the moral and normative concepts that we already have in new and sort of unexpected ways.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great way to end. Thank you for your wonderful talk. And thanks everyone for sticking through a long day of really invigorating, rich work. I'm sure you're all very hungry. So any of you who are here are invited. There's India Pavilion, which is just a short, like 10-minute walk or so, is waiting for us. Thank you all very much. Can you get a round of applause for the speakers?
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this day. And to Victoria for being
yes, and thank you to Victoria, to Izzy for doing all kinds of organizational work. The consortium, the Rock, Liberal Arts, Social Science Research Institute, philosophy, psychology. I'm missing one. Lots of great people are excited by the work you're doing, and so yeah, definitely come out tomorrow. It's going to be in a different room. It's in 113, the mezzanine on the first floor. We'll hear from Kyle, Chuck Huff, Desiree Lim, and Linda Trevino. That's correct. Thank you. But yeah, if you are here tomorrow, please drop on by, and online I'll send a note about the Zoom link. Thank you all.
Thank you, Daryl.